Renal tubular acidosis, nothing as exciting, nothing as special as an RTA. RTA suffers from very difficult terminology. Type 1, type 2, type 4. Well, where's type 3? I don't know. That's part of the difficulty. Where's type 3? Man, if they wanted me to learn it, they would have called it type 1 and 2 and 3. Instead, they call it type 1, 2, and 4. Now, the next thing that's a pain is this. Type 1 is a distal. Man, unless they wanted me to know it, they should call type 1 proximal and type 2 distal, but they didn't. So it's inverted. What are we doing? Reading in Hebrew here. Reading left to right. Right to left. Right to left. Left to right. Oh, man, it's too painful. Too painful. So type 1, we have basically two different things that go on the kidney tube to maintain acid base. One, we can excrete acid. Number two, you can absorb base. It's like money, man. You can either make more or spend less. You can either make more or spend less. So the thing is that in terms of acid base in the distal tubule, what happens is that normally in the distal tubule you excrete hydrogen ions. In the distal tubule, what you normally do is you excrete acid, hydrogen ions. You bind them with ammonia to become ammonium and with phosphate. Now the problem in a type 1 RTA is that you can't excrete the acid. And because you can't excrete the acid into the kidney tubule, the urine is basic. Because you can't excrete the acid, the urine stays basic. Now, the memorization of what exactly caused this is not that important. I would memorize sickle cell and any chronic kidney disease really, but sickle cell and amphotericin, for instance. But I wouldn't spend a lot of time torturing myself about like all the list of things, the Wilson diseases of the world, and not worth it. What's worth it is to say, if I can't excrete acid, you see this? Urine pH is high. If I can't excrete acid, the urine's got to be basic. And if the urine is basic, you see this? You form stones and nephrocalcinosis. What happens in a basic urine? You get stones and nephrocalcinosis. If the calcium precipitates in the tubules, it's kidney stones, nephrolithiasis. If the calcium precipitates within the parenchyma of the kidney itself, it's nephrocalcinosis. The kidney becomes like a calcium rock. So what's the diagnostic test? So you say you cannot excrete acid, yeah. Well, what if we give you some acid? We will make your kidneys talk, yeah? You say you cannot excrete acid. Well, I will give you some acid. And a normal person should excrete that acid. No, don't infuse acid into me. You should urinate it right off. A normal person should urinate it right off. But here you give them acid and they can't excrete it. So you give them acid. Oh, no, I'm melting. You give them acid and the urine stays basic. Why does the urine stay basic? Because you can't excrete the acid. That's the whole point. Look for stones. Now the distal tubule is kind of screwed here. You can't excrete acid, but you can absorb base very nicely because the proximal tubule is okay. Proximal tubule absorbs base. Proximal tubule absorbs base. Proximal tubule absorbs bicarb. So since the distal tubule is poor, the proximal tubule is good. So the treatment is you just give them bicarb. That's the treatment. You just give them bicarb. The proximal tubule, you just give them bicarb. Both type 1 and type 2 RTA have hypokalemia, have low potassium. Only type 4 has a high potassium. Type 1 and 2 both have a low potassium. Only type 4 has a high potassium. These others both have low potassium. Distal RTA. In the distal tube you excrete acid to form ammonium and phosphoric acid. If I can't excrete acid, the urine is basic. In a basic urine, you form stones and nephrocalcinosis. The test is I give you acid, a normal person should excrete it. These people can't excrete it, so the urine stays basic. In the distal tube, you can't excrete acid, but in the proximal tube, you can absorb bicarb just fine. So you give them bicarb. You give them bicarb. You give them bicarb. Now, proximal, oh my God, look at all this stuff. I can't stand it. Fanconi, Wilson, amyloid, metazole, blah, blah, too many things here, too many things. Now is the time for you to hit pause and memorize some things if you must. Fanconi's is a proximal tubular disease, period. But all these things is really saying, well, almost anything that can kill the kidney. Too much. The main issue is here. In a proximal tubule, the proximal tubule absorbs bicarb. But a proximal RTA means you can't absorb the bicarb. If you can't absorb the bicarb, the urine is basic for a while until all the bicarb runs out of the body, until all the bicarb runs out of the body, until all the bicarb runs out of the body. And when all the bicarbonate runs out, when all the bicarbonate runs out of the body, it's like, oh, listen, we have a defect, the proximal tubular defect. Oh, all the bicarb's running out of the body. Oh, the bicarb, my proximal RTA, I'm running out of bicarb out of the body. Oh, my bicarb's gone. Oh, look, I ran out of bicarb. The bicarb is now run out of the body. Is there any bicarb coming out now? No, because I got a hole, I got a defect in my tubule. It's all spilled out. But then, eventually, none comes out. So what happens is the urine is acid because, oh, I got a defect, all the bicarb came out, oh! Now the bicarb is all run out because we got a hole. So what ends up happening? The urine now becomes acid. And since it's an acid urine, no calcium carbonate stones, no calcinosis. Oh. Now, the diagnostic test. The diagnostic test is that what you're going to do is you're going to give acid. Okay? And give base. So what happens? You give, can't absorb bicarb, you're going to give bicarb, I should say. Give bicarb. Now, a normal person, if they were acidotic, shouldn't be excreting the bicarb. They should hold on to every molecule of bicarb. By the way, renal tubular acidosis doesn't mean the renal tubular is acidotic. It means the body is acidotic on the basis of a renal tubular defect. The renal tubule can be basic. The renal tubule can be acid. But the body is acidotic. If I give you bicarb and you're acidotic, you should hold on to all of it. Here you give them bicarb and they can't absorb it. So the urine is basic. The urine is basic because they can't absorb it. Oh, that's a problem. That's a problem. So the treatment for this, as you are running out of all of the bicarb in your body, is the acidy blood sucks the calcium out of your bones. Makes your bones weak and demineralized. So what do? You can give massive amounts of bicarbonate. That's true, you can give massive amounts of bicarbonate, but no matter how much bicarbonate you give, you're never going to be able to fill the volume of the body. So what you do is you give a diuretic to decrease the volume of the body. You can't fill the whole body, so you give a diuretic to decrease the volume of the body. You can't fill the whole volume of the body, so you give a diuretic to decrease the volume of the body. I can't fill the whole body, so you give a diuretic to decrease the volume of the body. I can't give you enough bicarb to fill the whole body, so I give you a diuretic to decrease the volume of the body. Giving a diuretic. Giving a diuretic. And that's the management. You can't absorb bicarb, you can give massive amounts of bicarb, and you give a diuretic to decrease the volume of the body. Now, type 4 RTA is basically saying all the things that decrease aldosterone in the body. Type 4 RTA is basically saying, well, what are all the things that will decrease aldosterone? The main thing you're going to see a diabetic with a decreased renin, hyporenin, hypoaldostate. Hyporenin and hypoaldostate. Hyporenin and hypoaldo. It's also the only one that gives hyperkalemia. It's also the only one that gives hyperkalemia. It's also the only one that gives hyperkalemia. Diabetic, Hyporenin, hypoaldo. Hey, I don't have enough aldosterone. So what do? Give some aldosterone. How do I give you aldosterone? Fludrocortisone. Fludrocortisone is a way of giving you aldosterone. How do I give you aldosterone? I give you fludrocortisone. Fludrocortisone is the closest thing to giving you aldosterone. Now, renal tubular acidosis, type 1, 2, 4. Oh, what a drag. There's no 3. No 3 you got to know about. It's much better for you to say proximal and distal RTA because that'll help you with memorizing what's there. The proximal tubule absorbs bicarb. The distal tubule excretes hydrogen ions. I can't excrete hydrogen ions, my urine becomes basic. In a basic urine, I form stones. I can't excrete acid, but I can absorb bicarb nicely. Proximal RTA, I can't absorb bicarb. The bicarb runs out of my body until there's no bicarb left to run out of the body, and the urine becomes acid. In an acid urine, you don't form stones. You give bicarbonate and it spills out in the urine. So you give a diuretic to decrease the volume of the body. Type 4 RTA, a diabetic with a high potassium with a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Remember, every one of these 3 has a normal anion gap because they all have an elevated chloride. They all have an elevated chloride. They all have an elevated chloride. And that's why they're all normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. There are basically 2 types of normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. RTAs and diarrheas. RTAs and diarrheas are the 2 normal anion gap metabolic acidoses. That's the end of RTA, which is a complex and challenging section because it's not something you think about a lot. Would I tell you about it if you didn't have to know it? No, I wouldn't bother. Normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Ready? A normal anion gap metabolic acidosis means either diarrhea or renal tubular acidosis. The urine anion gap can actually distinguish them. That's a very advanced 99th percentile thing. Urine anion gap can tell you the difference between RTA and diarrhea. But RTAs is this. Even though it's called renal tubular acidosis, the renal tubule can be acidotic, the renal tubule can be alkalotic, but the body is acidotic on the basis of a renal tubular defect. Type 4 diabetic with a high potassium, give fludrocortisone. They'll either look for stones or for no stones. And repeat it, and it will feel easy. And by the 3rd time, it's going to be as simple as spooning food into your mouth. And you'll feel happy, relaxed. I will now count to 3. And on the count of 3, you will fall asleep and be relaxed. 1, 2, 3.